product, I am less willing to pay for that product because I get less and less happiness from that product. I mean, right, the example is really simple, right? Like, I love sushi. And I love sushi so much that, and this is true, on every birthday I eat the number of pieces of sushi as I am years of age, right? And so I'm 34 years old. That means that, right, I have 34 pieces of spicy tuna sushi, right? And I sit in the parking lot of a grocery store and I sit with a liter of Sprite and a big tray of sushi and I just eat the whole tray. Now, usually somewhere in the mid-20s, right, I start feeling really sick, right, because I've had 20 pieces of sushi, right? The first few were really, really good, right? But by number 28 and 29, I wonder why would I ever start such a tradition of doing this, right? That if, you know, if the grocery store had charged me per piece of sushi a different price, right? Not the same price, right? In my case, I paid the same price for each piece of sushi. But what if the sushi chef had said, I'm going to ask you, and you're going to respond to me truthfully, how much you really want each piece of sushi, right? For the first one, it'd be like, oh man, I've really wanted sushi for a really long time. I'm willing to pay $10 for that very first piece of sushi because I want it so badly, right? That's where we could get something way up here. Now, after that first piece, I'm like, yeah, I'd still like some more sushi. You know, I'm still hungry, but I'm not as hungry as I used to be. I've already had now the taste of sushi in my mouth, so I'm not willing to pay as much. And so on and so on and so on. All the way down to like the 34th piece of sushi where it's zero. Or we might even think it starts to go negative, right? That I might actually pay something to not have to eat the sushi. Let's not assume that, right? Let's just say that the price will end at zero, right? Where if you gave it to me free, I would still eat it, but that's the only condition under which I would eat it. Again, that's the principle of diminishing marginal utility. And that's linked to the diminishing reservation price. The reservation price is my maximum willingness to pay for the product. So my maximum willingness to pay for the product is falling as the quantity is rising. Okay, now we're going to use these things then to further explain the nature of why the demand curve is downward sloping, or why we have the law of demand. Now, we know that we have the law of diminishing marginal utility. We know that we have diminishing reservation prices. But perhaps an easier way to think of this, right, is that what we want to do and then when I make a large Q subscript D, that's going to mean quantity demanded. A big D is just going to mean demand. That my quantity demanded rises when the price of the good falls. There are going to be two reasons for this inverse relationship, this inverse causal relationship that's going to explain demand. And that's going to be the income effect and the substitution effect. The income effect is going to say that as the prices are rising, I feel poorer. Even though my income hasn't changed, the purchasing power of my income has changed, right? Let's say I get $1,000 a year. That's my income, right? If all prices have doubled, right, even though I still have $1,000 of income, the purchasing power, what I can buy with my $1,000 of income, has been reduced by half because all the prices have doubled. So because I feel poorer, I'm probably not willing to buy as much as I used to. For the substitution effect, right, that as the prices are rising, I'm going to substitute away from that product, right? So let's say that soft drinks rise in price, right? Then I might be more inclined to buy Gatorade, right, or water, right, bottled water. I'll buy other products that are cheaper because the other price of the other good is increasing in price. What we've explained here with the income effect and the substitution effect is movements along the demand curve, right? All I have done, I don't have to emphasize it any further, right? is I've just drawn a demand curve, a very simple downward sloping demand curve. Downward sloping because of the law of demand, ceteris paribus, everything else equal, price falling, quantity demanded rising. Is that all I've done with the income effect and substitution effect is said that it's downward sloping and that it's a causal relationship. Causal because of the income effect and substitution effect. But then the question is, what happens when I relax ceteris paribus? Or in other words, right, to go back to our original drawing here, right, what happens when I allow everything other than the price of the good itself? What happens when I allow these other things to change? That's what we're going to look at next, right? So the one thing that we could look at here, right, is the price of substitutes goods. Okay, so what we're talking about here was phones. So in terms of substitutes for the phone, right, we could think of email, we could think of, if this is mobile phones, we could think of landlines, we could think of using the internet, right, using that to make calls. That when the price of the substitute falls, right? So in other words, let's say that as a as an internet company that sells internet phones, I reduce my price. Let's say Skype reduces its price down to $1 a month. That's going to encourage me to drop my mobile phone plan, right? Now this D-subscript phone, that means the demand curve is decreasing. Let's make a very, let's just highlight something here. What that's going to mean, right, is that if the demand is falling, that's very different than the quantity demanded falling, right? And be very important, I want you to emphasize your labels on your axes for your graphs. What I've drawn right here is demand falling, decreasing demand. As would be demonstrated up here, when the price of a substitute good falls, the demand curve changes. The whole curve changes. That's not explained by the law of demand. The law of demand only explains things like this. Movements along the demand curve. This is a shift of the demand curve. This is a movement along the demand curve. All that the law of demand does is explain movements along the demand curve. This here, the only thing that causes it is changing the price of the good itself. In this case, the price of the good itself increased. Here, I decreased the demand, D sub 1, right? And it fell because the price of the substitute fell. So, right, so if this is having a landline phone, right, or a mobile phone, the fact that internet phones fell in price would mean that my demand for mobile phones might decrease. The other type of good we could talk about here as a related good is the complementary good.